Captain Derek Morrison hadn't slept properly in 6 months. 6 months of deployment in the Persian Gulf, 6 months of pre-dawn flight operations, 6 months of tactical missions that consumed every ounce of his focus and energy. Now, as Flight 447 pushed back from Gate 12 at Los Angeles International Airport, Derek felt the weight of those months settling into his bones like sediment. He was exhausted in a way that only combat veterans truly understand, the kind of exhaustion that penetrates deeper than mere physical fatigue. It was the exhaustion of constantly being alert, of knowing that every decision could mean life or death, of carrying responsibility for the lives of 12 other SEALs under his command. The gate agent had waved him through with a knowing nod when she saw his dress uniform. Navy personnel always got that look, a subtle combination of respect and sympathy. Respect for service, sympathy for what that service cost. Derek had smiled politely but said nothing. 19 years in the Navy had taught him that talking about the burden wasn't necessary. Everyone could see it in how he moved, how his shoulders carried tension even in rest, how his eyes constantly scanned his environment out of pure operational habit. He'd chosen a window seat in the 14C position, far enough back to avoid conversation, but with a view that allowed him to observe the aircraft's systems. Even on a commercial flight, his military training was impossible to turn off. He watched the flight attendants conducting their safety demonstration with practiced efficiency, noted the emergency exits and their distances, calculated whether he could reach them quickly if needed. These weren't paranoid thoughts. They were simply how his brain had been rewired after nearly 2 decades of military service. Derek settled into his seat, still wearing his Navy flight suit, the khaki one with the golden naval aviator wings pinned above his name tape. His carry-on bag, stowed in the overhead compartment, contained his personal dress uniform, his medals carefully folded between layers of tissue paper, and photographs of his family that he'd looked at approximately 4,000 times during his deployment. His daughter had sent him drawings. His wife had written him letters. His son had written in shaky handwriting, "Dad, come home safe." That letter was folded in his pocket right now. The aircraft pushed back from the gate at 2:47 p.m. Pacific time. Through the window, Derek watched the ground crew disconnect the jet bridge and move the tug equipment clear. The familiar sensation of movement began, that peculiar feeling when you're not sure if the plane is moving or the world around you is. Then the engines began their characteristic spin-up, that distinctive whine that only those who spent their lives in the sky could find comforting. To Derek, it sounded like home. After 19 years, the vibration of jet engines felt more familiar than solid ground. The aircraft continued its push to the runway, taxiing slowly behind other aircraft in the queue. Airport traffic was typical for a Tuesday afternoon, not the chaos of Friday evening, but busy enough that it took 15 minutes to reach the runway. Derek watched LAX recede behind them, the terminals, the parking garages, the endless sprawl of Los Angeles spreading to the horizon. Somewhere down there was his family's home, though they were currently at his mother's house preparing a welcome home dinner. His wife, Jennifer, was planning to have his favorite meal ready: lasagna, garlic bread, and a tiramisu that she'd learned to make from his Italian grandmother's recipe. The captain's voice came through the intercom with practiced smoothness. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain James Harrison in the flight deck. We're next in line for takeoff. We've got smooth flying ahead, and we should arrive in Denver on schedule at approximately 6:15 p.m. Mountain Time. Flight attendants, please take your seats for departure." Derek closed his eyes. The roar of the engines increased as Flight 447 moved onto the runway. He felt the acceleration begin, that peculiar moment when the aircraft transitions from taxi to flight mode. The engine screamed with power. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the wheels left the tarmac. Derek's inner ear registered the change in G-forces as the nose pitched upward. They were airborne. The climb to cruising altitude was textbook perfect. Through the window, Derek watched Los Angeles fall away beneath them, the city getting smaller and smaller until it was just abstract patterns of streets and buildings. The aircraft climbed through 10,000 feet, where the captain turned off the seat belt sign and the flight attendants began their beverage service. Derek opened his eyes briefly, considered ordering coffee, then decided against it. Coffee would keep him awake, and he needed sleep more than he needed alertness right now. He'd be home soon. 3 weeks of leave stretched ahead like a promise. 3 weeks with Jennifer, with his kids, with normalcy. He didn't expect to feel completely normal. That ship had sailed years ago, but he could at least be present. He could help with homework. He could attend his daughter's soccer game. He could sleep in his own bed with his wife beside him instead of in a narrow bunk that smelled of diesel fuel and other men's sweat. The aircraft continued climbing, and Derek drifted. He thought about his last mission, a covert insertion that had gone sideways when the intelligence proved incomplete. 3 team members had been injured. He'd gotten them all out alive, and the intelligence failure had been documented in reports that would travel up the chain of command. But those details were compartmentalized now, locked away in the SEAL training compartments of his mind that he'd learned to activate and deactivate at will. The altitude stabilized at 34,000 feet. Outside the window, Derek could see the curvature of the Earth becoming apparent, that transition point where the sky shifted from blue to purple to black at the edges of visible space. He'd flown this route dozens of times, and it never got old. There was something humbling about being suspended between Earth and space, watching the world from above, understanding in that moment how small all human problems really were when viewed from this perspective. Derek reclined his seat slightly and pulled the blanket from his lap. He wore his watch set to Pacific time. There would be time to adjust later. His phone was set to airplane mode in his pocket. There was no one he needed to communicate with right now. Jennifer knew his flight number. His commanding officer knew his schedule. For the next 4.5 hours, he could simply exist in this suspended space between deployment and home. Within minutes, Derek Morrison was asleep. His body, finally given permission to rest, surrendered completely. His breathing deepened and steadied. His face, which normally carried the tension of command and responsibility, relaxed into something approaching peace. He slept the sleep of the truly exhausted, the kind where external stimuli couldn't penetrate until something truly catastrophic demanded his attention. The aircraft cruised smoothly across Arizona, continuing its eastward journey toward Denver. Most passengers barely noticed one military officer sleeping in seat 14, none of them could have imagined that in exactly 37 minutes, that sleeping man would become the difference between tragedy and survival. The first sign that something was wrong came as a vibration. It wasn't the normal vibration of cruise flight, the steady, predictable hum that Derek's body had learned to ignore during his sleep. This was different. This was wrong. It started as a subtle tremor in the armrest, a vibration that seemed to come from somewhere deeper in the aircraft's structure. Derek's subconscious registered it before his conscious mind fully awakened. His military training had burned certain responses so deeply into his neural pathways that they operated independent of conscious thought. His eyes snapped open. In the microsecond between sleep and wakefulness, Derek's brain performed a rapid assessment of his surroundings. Window seat, aircraft in cruise, afternoon light filtering through the shade he'd pulled down. Everything appeared normal, but his inner ear was screaming that something was very much not normal. The vibration was intensifying. Derek could feel it through the seat, through the armrest, through the very air in the cabin. Then came the sound. It started as a metallic grinding noise, a sound that no aircraft should ever make. It was the sound of metal stressed beyond its design parameters, the sound of machinery failing under pressure. Derek had heard similar sounds during emergency training simulations, but hearing it for real, while suspended at 34,000 feet in a metal tube, was an entirely different experience. His military instinct, dormant during sleep, roared back to life like a tiger awakening from hibernation. Around the cabin, other passengers were beginning to stir. A businessman 2 rows ahead looked up from his laptop, confusion crossing his face. An elderly woman gripped her armrest, her knuckles turning white. A young mother sitting across the aisle from Derek pulled her sleeping toddler closer, sensing something amiss even in her own half-awake state. Then the grinding sound intensified into a shriek. The aircraft suddenly bucked, a violent, unexpected movement that threw several passengers against their seats. A carry-on bag tumbled from the overhead compartment, landing in the aisle with a heavy thud. A flight attendant who had been standing in the galley stumbled backward, catching herself against the wall with difficulty. The overhead oxygen mask compartment sprang open with a pneumatic hiss, and yellow oxygen masks dropped from their storage slots throughout the cabin like mechanical jellyfish descending through water. People screamed. The sound of genuine terror filled the cabin, not the screams of minor turbulence, but the primal screams of human beings suddenly facing mortality. Derek watched a businessman too rose up grab his oxygen mask with shaking hands. A woman near the window was crying, whispering what sounded like prayers. The toddler across the aisle from Derek began wailing, frightened by the sudden chaos and the strange yellow mask hanging above her mother's seat. But Derek wasn't panicking. His body might have still been floating in the fog of recent sleep, but his tactical mind was already racing through calculations and assessments. He pulled his oxygen mask down and breathed deeply, his training overriding the instinct to hyperventilate. The cold rush of oxygen cleared the remaining fog from his brain, sharpening his focus into laser-like precision. The aircraft's attitude was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, the angle of descent, the way gravity was pulling at his body. They were losing altitude. They were losing it fast. Derek's military experience flying combat aircraft meant he understood what those physical sensations meant. An engine was out, possibly two. The hydraulic systems might be compromised. The aircraft was still controllable, but barely. A voice crackled over the intercom, the pilot's voice, but not with the practiced calm of routine flight operations. This voice carried the weight of extreme stress, the sound of a man making life-or-death decisions in real time. Cabin crew, prepare for emergency procedures. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. The flight attendants, trained for exactly this scenario, sprang into action with remarkable professionalism despite their own obvious fear. The lead flight attendant, a woman named Sarah whose name tag Derek could read from his seat, moved through the cabin with determined purpose. Her hands shook slightly. She was afraid, genuinely afraid, but she was doing her job. She helped passengers secure their oxygen masks, speaking in a voice that was slightly too high-pitched but steady enough to convey that everything possible was being done. Derek unbuckled his seatbelt. The motion was smooth, economical, practiced. Around him, other passengers were too focused on their own fear and confusion to notice one military officer moving with clear purpose. He secured his oxygen mask properly and rose from his seat, already analyzing the situation with the tactical precision that had kept him alive through multiple deployments. The aircraft bucked again, and Derek caught himself against the seatback, his military training giving him superior balance and body awareness compared to the civilians around him. A young businessman stumbled into the aisle, panic written across his face. Derek steadied him with one hand, making brief eye contact. "Sit down, secure your belt, keep your mask on," Derek said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command. The man obeyed immediately, something in Derek's tone cutting through his panic. Derek moved toward the front of the aircraft, his mind already formulating possibilities and responses. As a Navy pilot, he trained extensively on aircraft systems, emergency procedures, and aeronautical engineering. He understood how aircraft worked, how they could fail, and how they could be recovered. His presence in the cockpit might be necessary. It might make the difference between an emergency landing and a catastrophe. The aircraft shuddered again, and several passengers cried out. Derek steadied himself against the cabin wall, his warrior instincts fully activated now. He could hear the change in the engine noise, the characteristic sound of one engine running at maximum power while another had gone silent. Hydraulic fluid was likely leaking. The aircraft's handling was becoming sluggish and unpredictable. Derek reached the cockpit door just as Captain Sarah, the lead flight attendant, was about to knock. She looked at him with a mix of fear and desperate hope. Before she could say anything, Derek spoke quietly but with absolute certainty. "Navy pilot, ask the captain if he needs assistance up front." Sarah's eyes widened with something that looked like relief. She just found a lifeline in the middle of a crisis, though she didn't quite know it yet. She knocked urgently on the cockpit door, 3 sharp raps that carried the weight of emergency protocols. The door opened a crack, and a stern face appeared, Captain James Harrison, the lead pilot, his expression one of intense concentration mixed with barely contained panic. His eyes moved from Sarah to Derek, taking in the Navy flight suit, the confident bearing, the composed demeanor of someone who'd trained extensively for crisis situations. "We've got a critical engine failure," Harrison said, his voice tight. "Left engine is out, hydraulics compromised, if you can help." "I'm ready," Derek replied simply, already moving toward the cockpit. Behind him, the cabin erupted in fresh sounds of terror as the aircraft began its emergency descent. Derek stepped through the cockpit door, leaving behind the panicked civilians and entering the domain where seconds would determine whether 197 people would go home to their families or not. The door closed behind him with a decisive click. The cockpit of a commercial airliner is an intensely cramped space when everything is functioning normally. When the aircraft is in crisis, it becomes suffocatingly claustrophobic. Derek took in the scene in milliseconds. Captain James Harrison in the left seat fighting the control yoke with both hands, his knuckles white from the strain of keeping the aircraft stable. First Officer Michael Chen in the right seat was rapidly working through emergency procedures, his fingers moving across switches and dials with desperate precision. Behind them, the instrument panel blazed with warning lights, a constellation of red indicators that painted a grim picture of the aircraft's condition. "What do we have?" Derek asked, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of screaming engines and warning alarms. Harrison spoke without taking his eyes off the horizon line visible through the windscreen. "Left engine total failure approximately 4 minutes ago. Caught fire, fire suppression engaged. We've lost about 60% hydraulic pressure. Alternate systems are partially functional but unreliable. The aircraft is responding sluggishly to all control inputs." Derek moved deeper into the cockpit, his eyes scanning the instrument panel with practiced efficiency. His military background had taught him how to process vast amounts of technical information simultaneously. He focused on the critical indicators. The altimeter showed they were descending through 28,000 feet, currently losing altitude at approximately 1,500 feet per minute. The airspeed indicator showed 340 knots, still within normal operating parameters, but the descent rate was concerning given their current altitude and the distance they needed to cover. "Fuel status?" Derek asked, already mentally calculating endurance parameters. Chen gestured to the fuel quantity readout. "We've got 45 minutes of fuel remaining. With the current descent rate and heading toward Flagstaff, that should be enough, but we're cutting it close. Every minute of maneuvering burns additional fuel." Derek moved to the navigation display, studying the route information with the intensity of a chess master analyzing a complex position. Flagstaff was approximately 90 miles southeast of their current position. At their current descent rate, making the distance and landing safely would require precise fuel management and optimal descent planning. One miscalculation, one unnecessary maneuver, could mean the difference between reaching the runway and falling short over empty Arizona desert. "Have you declared the emergency?" Derek asked, though he could already hear the chatter of emergency response protocols being coordinated on the radio. "About 30 seconds after the engine failure," Harrison replied, his voice steady despite the obvious physical strain of keeping the aircraft on a controlled descent. Air traffic control is clearing the airspace around Flagstaff. They're staging emergency equipment now. Derek leaned over the center console, studying the distance to descent calculations Chen had been working through. The mathematics were simple but brutal. They needed to descend from 28,000 feet to sea level, approximately 27,000 feet of vertical distance, while traveling 90 miles horizontally, burning fuel as efficiently as possible, and managing an aircraft that was increasingly difficult to control due to hydraulic system compromise. "Harrison, you're going to need to manage the descent rate carefully," Derek said, his mind already formulating the optimal strategy. "Too steep, and will build up too much speed, increasing aerodynamic stress. Too shallow and will run out of fuel before reaching the runway. We need a descent rate of approximately 1,200 feet per minute to optimize our arrival time and fuel consumption." Harrison's jaw clenched slightly. He was already aware of these parameters. He was a professional pilot with thousands of hours of experience, but hearing the assessment confirmed by another experienced aviator seemed to steady him. There was something reassuring about shared understanding in a crisis. Derek wasn't here to take control. He was here to provide expert assessment and support. Chen was already adjusting the flight path, entering new waypoints into the navigation computer. The aircraft responded sluggishly, the control surfaces responding with noticeable delay due to the hydraulic system compromise. Derek could feel it, the way the aircraft seemed reluctant to obey commands, the way the control yoke resisted Harrison's input. It was like trying to steer a massive ship through oil instead of water. "The right landing gear might be compromised," Chen said quietly, pointing to an indicator light that was fluctuating between green and amber. "If it doesn't lock during landing." "We address that when we get there," Derek interrupted, his tone brooking no debate. "Right now, we focus on achieving a safe approach. Worry about one problem at a time or you'll overwhelm yourselves." The principle was fundamental to tactical operations. Compartmentalize, focus on immediate objectives, handle issues in priority order. Derek had learned this during his first SEAL deployment, and it had saved his life and the lives of his team dozens of times since. Derek keyed the radio with Harrison's permission. "Air traffic control, Flight 447. Current position, currently descending through 24,000 feet, estimating Flagstaff runway 3 in approximately 18 minutes. Requesting direct approach vectors and immediate ground equipment staging." The air traffic controller's voice came back immediately, professional and calm. "Copy, Flight 447, clearing direct to Flagstaff. All traffic cleared from your approach corridor. Emergency services are staged and ready. Flagstaff runway 3 is yours. Report when you have the field in sight." Derek studied the weather radar on the navigation display. Clear skies between their current position and Flagstaff, a small mercy in an otherwise dire situation. At least they wouldn't be fighting weather on top of mechanical failure. He turned and moved toward the cockpit door. "I need to brief the cabin crew and passengers. The uncertainty is causing panic. Knowledge is the antidote to panic." "What do I tell them?" Harrison asked, his voice revealing a moment of vulnerability beneath his professional composure. The captain was a skilled aviator, but he was also a human being carrying the weight of 197 lives in his hands. "Tell them the truth," Derek replied. "We have an experienced crew, we have a plan, and we're going to make it. Fear responds to honesty. Give them facts, not false reassurance." Derek exited the cockpit into the cabin where chaos still reigned, though it had diminished slightly. The initial panic had transformed into tense, anxious waiting. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, helping passengers with oxygen masks, speaking in low, reassuring tones. A businessman in 12F was holding his wife's hand so tightly his fingers had gone white. The young mother with the toddler was whispering what sounded like prayers. Derek moved to the main galley area where the flight attendants had gathered. Sarah, the lead attendant, looked up with desperate hope in her eyes. Behind her, two other flight attendants appeared on the verge of breaking down. "Listen," Derek said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command. "We have a critical situation, but it's manageable. The pilots are experienced professionals. I'm a Navy pilot, and I can confirm we have an excellent approach plan. What we need from you is to keep the passengers calm. Facts reduce fear. Tell them, engine failure confirmed, emergency services staged at Flagstaff, estimated landing in 18 minutes. Tell them to secure themselves and trust the crew." Sarah took a deep breath, visibly drawing strength from Derek's calm assessment. "You really think we're going to make it?" Derek met her eyes directly. "I wouldn't say it if I didn't mean it. Now go, give them information, give them hope." As the flight attendants dispersed to deliver this message to the cabin, Derek returned to the cockpit. Through the windscreen, he could see the Arizona landscape becoming clearer beneath them. The ground was no longer abstract patterns but actual terrain, mountains, valleys, small towns, all rushing upward to meet them. Flagstaff was out there somewhere, and they had 18 minutes to find it. 17 minutes remained on Derek's mental countdown when the radio crackled with new information. The Flagstaff Tower controller reported that runway maintenance was currently in progress on the primary runway. This single fact created a cascade of complications. Yes, they could still land at Flagstaff, but on the secondary runway, slightly shorter with different approach vectors, less sophisticated emergency equipment positioning. Derek absorbed this information and immediately began recalculating. Shorter runway meant less margin for error. A longer landing distance required would consume more runway space, and with the landing gear potentially compromised, every foot of available runway became critical. The mathematics of survival had just become more complex. "We have options," Derek said, studying the navigation display with intense focus. Flagstaff's secondary runway is 8,000 feet long. With our current weight and landing characteristics, we'd need approximately 6,500 feet for a normal landing. That gives us a 1,500-foot buffer, which is acceptable but not generous. Harrison's hands remained steady on the control yoke, but Derek could see the tension in his shoulders. "What are the other options?" Derek's finger traced the navigation screen. "Phoenix Sky Harbor is 145 miles south. Longer runways, more sophisticated emergency equipment, but it burns more fuel and extends our time in the air with a compromised aircraft. Williams Gateway is closer, approximately 60 miles east. Smaller facility, limited emergency equipment but shorter flight time and more fuel margin." Chen was already calling up the relevant airport information on his navigation computer. "Williams Gateway has 10,000 feet of runway. That's actually better than Flagstaff for a difficult landing." "But it's a smaller airport," Harrison countered, his pilot's mind already weighing the variables. "Less sophisticated emergency services. If something goes catastrophically wrong on approach." "Then we need to consider the probability of catastrophic failure," Derek interrupted, his voice calm and analytical. "We're currently at 22,000 feet with 41 minutes of flight time consumed. We have fuel reserves, but every mile we fly burns more fuel. The longer we stay in the air, the higher the probability of secondary system failures. The hydraulic system is already compromised. We need to minimize airtime." This was the kind of decision that defined careers, the moment where a pilot had to choose between the safe option and the option that was mathematically optimal. Derek understood this because he'd made similar decisions in tactical operations. Sometimes, caution was the enemy of survival. "We also have to consider fuel efficiency," Derek continued, pulling up the fuel consumption data. "At our current descent profile, we're burning approximately 5,000 pounds of fuel per 10 minutes. Flagstaff is 14 minutes away. Phoenix is 28 minutes away. Williams Gateway is 10 minutes away." The numbers were stark. Flagstaff would leave them with approximately 21,000 pounds of fuel upon landing, substantial reserves. Phoenix would leave them with only 5,000 pounds, dangerously close to minimum reserves. Williams Gateway would leave them with approximately 31,000 pounds, excellent margins. But there was more to consider than just fuel mathematics. "What about crash equipment positioning?" Derek asked Chen. "Emergency responders, fire suppression, medical facilities." Chen studied the airport information. "Flagstaff has a dedicated emergency response team. They're staging now, fire trucks, ambulances, the full protocol. Williams Gateway has basic emergency equipment, but they're a smaller facility. They'd have to call in additional resources from surrounding areas." Derek felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. 197 lives, one choice. The wrong decision could mean the difference between a survivable emergency landing and a catastrophe. He thought about the young mother with her toddler in the cabin, the elderly couple holding hands, the businessman whose wife was terrified, the businesswoman who'd been reading a novel when the emergency began, now clutching her seat in prayer. Harrison seemed to sense Derek's internal struggle. "What would you do?" the captain asked quietly, "if this was your decision to make?" Derek took a moment before responding. This was a crucial question, not just about aircraft systems and fuel consumption, but about leadership and accountability. If he recommended Flagstaff and something went wrong, families would lose loved ones. If he recommended Williams Gateway and emergency services proved inadequate, additional people might die. The burden of choice was crushing. "I would choose Williams Gateway," Derek said finally, his voice carrying complete conviction. "Here's why. We're operating a compromised aircraft with deteriorating systems. Every minute in the air increases the probability of cascading failures. We minimize airtime by choosing the closest adequate facility. Our fuel reserves provide a safety buffer for any approach complications. And yes, the emergency services are smaller, but they're still adequate for a controlled emergency landing. Commercial aircraft land at smaller airports successfully every single day." He paused, looking directly at Harrison. "But this is your decision to make. You're the captain. You carry the final responsibility. I can provide expert assessment, but you have to live with the consequences." Harrison's face was etched with the weight of command. He looked at Chen, who nodded slightly, a gesture that said, "I trust whatever decision you make." Then Harrison looked back at Derek. "Williams Gateway," Harrison said with quiet decisiveness. "We're going for Williams Gateway." Derek immediately keyed the radio. "Air traffic control, flight 447. We're diverting to Williams Gateway. Current position, currently descending through 20,000 feet. ETA Williams Gateway approximately 10 minutes. The air traffic controller acknowledged the change in destination and immediately began routing other traffic away from the Williams Gateway approach corridor. Within minutes, the small airport was being prepared for the incoming emergency. Fire trucks positioning, medical personnel standing by, every resource mobilized. Derek moved back into the cabin. The flight attendants were continuing their efforts to keep passengers calm, though fear was palpable in the recycled air. He found Sarah in the forward galley. "Change of destination," Derek told her. "We're landing at Williams Gateway instead of Flagstaff. Smaller airport, shorter flight time. I want you to inform the passengers that we're making excellent progress. The pilots are executing a perfect approach, and we should be on the ground in 10 minutes. Sarah's eyes widened slightly at the speed of development. 10 minutes. 10 minutes, Derek confirmed. "And Sarah, you've done exceptional work managing the cabin. The passengers are scared, but they're not panicking. That's because of you and your team." A slight smile crossed Sarah's face, the smile of someone who'd found purpose in the midst of terror. "We'll keep them together until we land." Derek returned to the cockpit where Harrison was already adjusting the flight path toward Williams Gateway. The Arizona landscape was now clearly visible below them. mountains with their distinctive ridges, highways threading through valleys, small towns scattered across the desert floor like dice thrown on a table. Derek studied the approach information for Williams Gateway displayed on the navigation screen. The runway was oriented northwest-southeast. Current wind was light and variable, not ideal but manageable. The terrain around the airport was relatively clear of major obstacles, which meant the approach would be straightforward. 9 minutes to touchdown, Chen announced, his voice steady as the aircraft descended through 15,000 feet. Derek felt something shift inside him, a settling of purpose. The decision had been made. They were committed now. The next 9 minutes would either result in a successful emergency landing or a tragedy that would be investigated for years. "Walk me through your approach strategy," Derek said to Harrison. "I want to understand exactly how you're planning to handle this." As Harrison outlined his approach procedure, Derek listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, offering subtle suggestions. The two pilots, one professional commercial aviator, one military combat pilot, began the final choreography of their emergency descent. Outside the windscreen, Williams Gateway grew from a distant point to a visible runway, getting larger with every passing second. The moment of truth arrived when the aircraft descended through 10,000 feet. At this altitude, the pressurization system automatically transitioned from maintaining cabin altitude to allowing the actual external pressure to equalize. Derek felt the subtle shift in air pressure, the slight increase in atmospheric density. Below them, the Arizona desert was no longer an abstract landscape, but harsh, unforgiving reality. There would be no second chances if this landing went wrong. There would be no ejection seats, no parachutes, no military rescue helicopters. Just physics, gravity, and the skill of the two pilots trying to keep 197 people alive. Williams Gateway Tower, Flight 447, currently descending through 10,000 feet. "We have the field in sight," Harrison reported, his voice carrying the practiced calm of a professional who'd flown emergency procedures 1,000 times in simulation, and now faced the genuine article. "Copy, Flight 447 cleared for approach runway 2. Winds 320 degrees at 8 knots, gusting to 12. You're cleared to land. Emergency equipment standing by," came the response from the tower. 8 minutes remained. Derek monitored the descent profile closely. They were following an optimal glide path, steep enough to lose altitude efficiently, but not so steep that they were building excessive airspeed. The aircraft was responding sluggishly to Harrison's control inputs, each movement of the control yoke requiring deliberate, calculated pressure. The compromised hydraulic system meant there was a slight lag between Harrison's commands and the aircraft's response, a delay measured in fractions of a second, but noticeable to someone trained to feel the aircraft's responses as naturally as his own body. "Flaps to 5 degrees, Harrison commanded, his hands moving across the control panel with practiced precision. Chen responded immediately, adjusting the flap settings. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the trailing edge flaps extended partially, creating additional drag and lift coefficient. Derek watched the airspeed indicator as the aircraft's velocity began to decrease. They were slowing down, preparing the aircraft for landing approach. This was the delicate balance that pilots walked, too fast and they'd overshoot the runway, too slow and they might stall. "Landing gear," Harrison said, though they all knew what was coming next. This was the moment they'd been dreading. The flashing amber light on the right landing gear indicator had been a constant reminder of the potential problem. Chen reached for the landing gear control and extended it. For a moment, a terrible, endless moment, nothing happened. The indicator lights remained in transition, refusing to show fully green. The three men in the cockpit held their breath. A landing gear failure on a short runway with a compromised hydraulic system would be catastrophic. Then slowly, the right gear indicator shifted to green. All three down and locked, Chen announced, and Derek heard the relief in his voice. Thank God, Harrison whispered, then refocused. Flaps to 10 degrees. Approach speed maintained at 180 knots. The aircraft continued its descent. 7 minutes gone, 3 minutes to touchdown. Derek moved to the window and looked down at the Williams Gateway runway, now clearly visible below them. It looked impossibly short from this altitude, a thin gray ribbon stretching across the desert floor. Emergency vehicles lined the sides of the runway, fire trucks with their lights flashing, ambulances, rescue equipment, personnel in reflective gear standing ready. The entire apparatus of emergency response was waiting for them. It was both reassuring and terrifying, a visible reminder that the aviation authorities understood how serious this situation had become. I've got to be honest with you, Derek said quietly to Harrison. I've flown combat missions, I've been in firefights, I've faced situations where my team was pinned down, but I've never felt tension quite like this. Harrison's mouth twitched slightly, not quite a smile but an acknowledgement of shared humanity. That's because this is different. In combat, you have some control over your circumstances. Here, we're all just passengers to physics and luck. No, Derek said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. Here, we have expertise. We have 2 excellent pilots executing perfect technique. We have an aircraft that, despite its damage, is still responding to commands. We have an adequate runway and emergency services standing by. The odds are actually in our favor. He wasn't entirely certain this was true, but he said it with such conviction that Harrison seemed to draw strength from it. The captain's shoulders straightened slightly, and his grip on the control yoke became steadier. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the reality of imminent landing was setting in. The young mother with her toddler had finally stopped crying, replacing tears with determined focus. She was fastening her daughter's seatbelt for the 3rd time, rechecking it obsessively. The businessman and his wife were holding hands so tightly it looked like they might fuse together. The elderly couple had their eyes closed, and Derek couldn't tell if they were praying or simply accepting whatever came next. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, moved through the cabin one last time, making sure every passenger was secured. She moved with the gravity of someone conducting a final inspection before battle. When she made eye contact with Derek through the open cockpit door, he gave her a subtle nod. She straightened her shoulders and returned the nod, 2 professionals acknowledging each other across the gulf of their different roles, united in the singular purpose of getting everyone safely to the ground. Flaps to 15 degrees. Prepare for landing, Harrison announced. The aircraft's nose pitched downward more steeply as they committed to the final approach. They were now committed, too low to climb back to altitude, too close to the ground to abort. There was no turning back. There was only forward toward the runway, toward either salvation or disaster. 5 minutes gone, less than 5 minutes remaining. Derek could feel the stress accumulating in his shoulders. His military training had prepared him for many things, but this particular moment, suspended between earth and sky, responsible for 197 lives, watching the runway grow larger and larger, was something beyond normal experience. He thought about Jennifer, waiting at his mother's house. He thought about his kids, who would be told if he didn't make it home. He thought about his crew in the Persian Gulf, unaware that their commanding officer was fighting for his life, 34,000 feet above Arizona. Then he pushed those thoughts away. Emotion was a luxury, focus was a necessity. Approach speed 165 knots, 3-degree glide path. We're looking good, Chen reported, his eyes fixed on the instrument panel. The runway was enormous now, filling the entire forward windscreen. Derek could see individual details, the runway markings, the chevrons painted on the asphalt, the fire trucks with their lights pulsing. They were so close that the landing seemed inevitable. But the last 500 feet of descent were the most dangerous, the point where so many things could still go wrong. Harrison's hands moved with the precision of a surgeon. Minute adjustments to the control yoke, deliberate pressure on the throttles, managing descent rate with the care of someone handling crystal. The aircraft responded, sluggishly, reluctantly, but it responded. 1,000 feet, Derek reported, reading the altitude directly. Looking good, descent rate is perfect. The ground was rushing up to meet them now. 500 feet, 400. Derek could see the emergency personnel scattered across the field, their faces turned upward toward the incoming aircraft. 100 of them, maybe more, all waiting to see if they would perform a rescue or attend to a tragedy. 300 feet, 200. The runway threshold was right there, almost within reach. 50 feet, Derek whispered, as much prayer as report. The aircraft floated above the runway, held aloft by aerodynamic forces, descended by gravity, guided by two men fighting to keep it stable. Touchdown, Harrison breathed, and Derek felt it. The subtle kiss of wheels meeting asphalt, the moment when an aircraft transitions from flying to landing. But the hardest part was just beginning. The moment the aircraft's wheels made contact with the runway, everything changed. What had been a controlled descent became a battle for stability. The landing gear, particularly the right side that had given them such concern, made contact with the asphalt at 165 miles per hour. For a fraction of a second, Derek held his breath, waiting to see if the landing gear would hold or collapse under the impact. The right gear held. But immediately, something went wrong. The aircraft lurched violently to the right, the landing gear catching slightly off-center as the weight of the massive aircraft transferred from the wings to the wheels. It was a sickening sensation, the entire fuselage tilting, the right side dipping lower than the left. In the cockpit, alarms screamed. In the cabin, passengers shrieked as they felt the aircraft's attitude shift at an impossible angle. "Right gear's not tracking properly," Chen shouted, his hands already moving across the control panel. Harrison's face contorted with concentration. His hands gripped the control yoke with desperate force, pulling back and to the left, fighting gravity and physics and the malfunctioning landing gear system. The aircraft wanted to tip, wanted to roll onto its right wing, wanted to cartwheel down the runway. Every ounce of Harrison's skill and experience was focused on preventing exactly that outcome. Derek moved instantly, reading the situation with tactical precision. "Starboard engines to idle, port engines to reverse thrust," he commanded. It was an unconventional procedure, not in the standard operating manual, but it was exactly what they needed in this moment. By reducing power on the failing right side and applying reverse thrust asymmetrically, they could counteract the rolling moment. Harrison trusted the recommendation enough to execute it without hesitation. His fingers flew across the throttle panel. The engine noise changed pitch, a deep mechanical howl as the reversers deployed on the left side. The aircraft's rolling moment began to correct, the right wing rising slowly, agonizingly slowly, back toward level. But they were still moving at 120 miles per hour. The runway was finite. Every second, they were consuming precious distance. "Nose gear, watch for shimmy," Derek called out, his eyes fixed on the attitude indicator. The nose gear was strut could be damaged from the initial gear impact. If it started to vibrate excessively, what pilots called shimmy, the nose gear could collapse and they'd be sliding on the fuselage through the desert. For 5 eternal seconds, the aircraft wobbled between normal landing and catastrophic failure. The right gear continued to track abnormally, the aircraft's direction of travel drifting slightly right despite Harrison's control input. The emergency vehicles on the sides of the runway tracked their progress, their personnel frozen in place, watching helplessly as the crisis unfolded at tremendous speed. Then slowly, the aircraft's attitude stabilized. The right gear, though not perfectly aligned, continued to support its portion of the aircraft's weight. The nose gear remained intact. The aircraft was landing, however imperfectly, but landing nonetheless. "Speed 75 knots, Chen called out. They'd already consumed a quarter of the runway, and they were still moving dangerously fast. "Full reverse thrust," Harrison commanded, and both port engines roared in protest as their reversers engaged fully. The deceleration was brutal, pressing everyone forward against their seatbelts. In the cabin, passengers cried out as they were thrown forward, breath knocked from their lungs by the G-forces of emergency deceleration. In seat 24B, the elderly woman nearly had her glasses knocked from her face. The businessman and his wife were pressed against their seatbelts so violently that the wife gasped in pain. The young mother shielded her toddler, wrapping her arms around the child to prevent her from being thrown forward. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, had braced herself in the jump seat near the cockpit, her eyes wide as she watched the emergency unfold with first-hand knowledge of every catastrophic possibility. Speed 50 knots. Chen's voice was barely audible over the howl of the reversers and the screech of brakes being applied with maximum pressure. The runway was disappearing beneath them. They'd already used 2/3 of the 10,000-foot runway, and they were still doing 50 knots. Derek did the mathematics in his microsecond calculations. At current deceleration rate, they had maybe 1,800 feet remaining. If the brakes held, if the aircraft stayed on the runway, if the main gear didn't collapse, they would make it. Barely. "Hydraulic pressure dropping," Chen shouted, his voice tight with panic. The emergency braking was consuming hydraulic fluid faster than it could be supplied. The system was running dry. "Manual brakes," Derek commanded, reaching toward the backup hydraulic system. His hands moved with the precision of someone who'd practiced emergency procedures until they lived in his muscle memory. He engaged the alternate brake system, pulling the manual override control with controlled force. The aircraft shuddered. The deceleration increased, brutal and unforgiving, speed 40 knots, 35. The runway was almost gone. They were approaching the end of the concrete, approaching the desert, approaching the point of no return. If the aircraft ran off the end of the runway at any speed above 10 knots, it would be catastrophic on the rough, uneven terrain. 20 knots, Chen called out, his voice higher than normal, reflecting the final desperate moments of the landing. The runway markings became a blur, then a steady pattern, then individual stripes visible through the windscreen. Derek watched the runway end approaching with terrible clarity. 500 feet remaining. 400. 300. The aircraft was slowing, but not fast enough, not in time. They weren't going to make it. 200 feet. 10 knots. Chen's voice broke slightly. 100 feet. The aircraft's speed dropped to single digits. The runway was ending, was right there, concrete giving way to desert sand and rocks. The aircraft's nose wheel was maybe 50 feet from the edge of the runway. And then, almost imperceptibly, the aircraft stopped rolling forward. The wheels ceased their rotation. The engines hung silent, the reversers retracted. The aircraft sat motionless on the runway, nose wheel positioned maybe 30 feet from the concrete's edge. In the cockpit, no one moved. No one spoke. No one even breathed. Then slowly the weight of what had just happened seemed to settle on them all. They were alive. The aircraft was stopped. The emergency was over. Harrison's head dropped forward, his chin nearly touching his chest. His hands released the control yoke, and they trembled visibly. Chen made a sound that was something between a laugh and a sob. Derek closed his eyes for just a moment, allowing himself 1 second of pure emotion before the next phase of crisis management began. Outside the windscreen, emergency vehicles began moving. Fire trucks and ambulances accelerated toward the aircraft. Personnel in reflective gear sprinted toward the fuselage. They'd been standing by, waiting to see if rescue would be needed or if there would be nothing to rescue but remains. In the cabin, the silence was absolute for one perfect moment. Then, as the passengers and crew realized they were alive, the cabin erupted. Cheers, screams, tears, prayers offered in gratitude and relief. The young mother held her daughter and wept. The elderly couple embraced. The businessman pulled his wife close and simply held her, both of them shaking. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, made her way forward to the cockpit. She looked at Derek, at Harrison, at Chen. Her eyes were red from tears and her hands still shook from adrenaline. But she was smiling, a genuine, relieved smile of someone who'd been given a reprieve from tragedy. "We made it," she said simply. "We actually made it." In the cockpit, Derek Morrison, Navy SEAL, military pilot, warrior, allowed himself a single moment of weakness. He rested his forehead against the cool glass of the cockpit window and whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever forces had allowed them to survive the unsurvivable. They had made it. Against odds that should have favored disaster, they had made it. The emergency slides deployed with a pneumatic hiss, yellow and white fabric unfurling against the Arizona desert sky. Emergency personnel surrounded the aircraft, maintaining perimeter security while paramedics stood ready with medical equipment. The evacuation proceeded with controlled urgency, passengers descending the slides in rapid succession, some needing assistance from emergency responders, others moving with surprising speed despite shaking legs and shock-glazed eyes. Derek remained in the cockpit for the initial evacuation, ensuring that the flight crew and essential personnel were coordinated. But once Captain Harrison confirmed that all passengers and crew were safely off the aircraft, Derek made his way through the cabin. What he encountered was not panic anymore, but something more profound: the raw, unfiltered emotion of people who'd been given a second chance at life. The young mother was waiting near the exit slide, her daughter clutched tightly in her arms. When she saw Derek emerging from the cockpit, she froze. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the exhausted Navy pilot in his wrinkled flight suit, and the mother who'd thought she might never see her daughter grow up. Then the woman's face crumpled, and she stepped forward, still holding her daughter with one arm while wrapping the other around Derek in a fierce embrace. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest, her voice breaking. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Derek, uncomfortable with the physical affection but understanding its necessity, gently returned the embrace. "Your daughter is safe," he said simply. "That's what matters." As he made his way down the emergency slide, more passengers intercepted him. An elderly gentleman grabbed his hand and held it with surprising strength. "I'm 83 years old," the man said, his eyes wet with tears. "I thought I'd seen everything life had to offer, but I never thought I'd experience something like this. You saved my life. You saved all our lives." Derek wanted to deflect, to redirect credit to Harrison and Chen, to explain that he'd simply provided technical assistance. But he also understood something deeper, that people needed to express gratitude, that denying them that expression was its own form of selfishness. So instead, he simply said, "I'm glad you're safe." On the tarmac at Williams Gateway, the scene was chaos tempered by professional emergency response. Paramedics were checking passengers for injuries, most of whom were physically fine but deeply traumatized. A woman in her 50s sat on the bumper of an ambulance, wrapped in a blanket despite the Arizona heat, staring at nothing. A teenage boy was on his phone, calling his family to let them know he was alive. The businessman Derek had steadied during the initial emergency was being examined by an EMT, who seemed to be checking for injuries related to the extreme deceleration during landing. Captain James Harrison emerged from the aircraft and immediately spotted Derek on the tarmac. The two men made eye contact, and without words, an understanding passed between them. They'd gone through something together that most people would never experience. There was a bond now, forged in fire and crisis. Harrison walked directly to Derek and extended his hand. "I want you to know," the captain said, his voice rough with emotion, "that without you in that cockpit we wouldn't have made it. You didn't panic. You didn't hesitate. You made the right call on every decision." Derek gripped Harrison's hand firmly. "You flew that aircraft down flawlessly. You made the landing happen. I was just—" "You were exactly what we needed," Harrison interrupted. "Don't diminish that." Within an hour, the story had spread beyond Williams Gateway Airport. A local news crew had been monitoring emergency frequencies and arrived within minutes of the aircraft's touchdown. By evening, the narrative was moving through regional networks. By the following morning, it had reached national news outlets. Navy SEAL pilot saves 197 lives after commercial flight emergency. Derek's phone began ringing before dawn. His commanding officer at Naval Air Station North Island called, his voice thick with emotion. "Morrison, what the hell happened out there? I'm getting calls from the Navy Secretary's office. You're a hero." "Sir, I just assisted the flight crew," Derek protested. "Captain Harrison and First Officer Chen are the ones who would be dead right now if you weren't on that flight," his commanding officer interrupted. "Do you understand what you've done? You've saved a plane full of people. You've represented the Navy and SEAL teams with incredible professionalism under extraordinary pressure. Accept the recognition, Morrison. You've earned it." By mid-morning, Derek had been contacted by CNN, Fox News, NBC, and a dozen other media outlets. He declined all interviews initially, uncomfortable with the spotlight, but his mother called him, tears evident in her voice. "Derek, I'm so proud of you. Your wife is so proud of you. Your children are so proud of you. Please just let people know what you did. Let them see that their son and husband is a hero." Jennifer, his wife, was waiting for him at San Diego International Airport when his connecting flight landed. She saw him emerge from the jet bridge and simply ran toward him, not caring who was watching. She threw her arms around him and held him like she might never let go. Behind her, Derek's two children, his daughter Sarah, age 11, and his son James, age 8, waited their turn, their faces a mixture of pride and confusion at seeing their father suddenly famous. That evening, after his children had been put to bed and Jennifer was preparing dinner, Derek sat in his living room watching news coverage of the emergency landing. News cameras showed the damaged aircraft, emergency personnel surrounding it, passengers being evaluated by paramedics. Then the footage shifted to footage taken on the tarmac, Derek emerging from the aircraft, passengers approaching him, embracing him. One news anchor was saying, "Captain Derek Morrison, a Navy SEAL pilot with 19 years of military service, happened to be a passenger on Flight 447 when the emergency occurred. His quick thinking and expertise in aircraft systems proved to be the difference between tragedy and survival. The flight crew has credited him with making critical decisions that allowed them to divert to a smaller airport and execute a landing that, by all rights, should have ended catastrophically." Jennifer came and sat beside him on the couch, taking his hand. "You were incredible," she said simply. "I always knew you were brave. I always knew you were skilled. But seeing it like this, understanding how close we came to losing you." Derek squeezed her hand but said nothing. The weight of recognition was almost as heavy as the weight of responsibility had been during the crisis. In the cockpit, his focus had been singular: save these people. But now, watching footage of the incident, reading social media responses that were already calling him a hero, receiving phone calls from strangers expressing gratitude, it was overwhelming in a different way. Captain Harrison had called earlier that evening. "I've been talking to some of the passengers," Harrison said. "They want to organize some kind of gathering, a thank you dinner or something, to acknowledge everyone who made it possible, the flight crew, the emergency responders, you. Would you be willing to participate?" Derek had agreed, though he wasn't entirely certain why. Perhaps it was because Jennifer had squeezed his hand when he looked at her for guidance. Perhaps it was because some of the passengers had lost so much in that moment of crisis, their sense of safety, their confidence in air travel, their illusion that disaster only happened to other people. Maybe they needed to see that their savior was just a human being, that survival was possible, that second chances existed. By the following morning, the story had become even more prominent. One passenger had recorded video of Derek in the cockpit, visible through the open cockpit door as he made critical decisions. Another had written a detailed account of Derek steadying her during the initial emergency. A third had described how Derek had moved through the cabin afterward, checking on passengers and crew, ensuring everyone was accounted for. The story of the Navy SEAL pilot who'd woken up in the middle of an aviation emergency and calmly used his training and expertise to save 197 lives had captured the public imagination. And Derek Morrison, who'd never sought recognition, who'd spent 19 years serving his country in relative anonymity, suddenly found himself at the center of an international news cycle. He looked at the photographs of his family on the shelf beside the television, Jennifer smiling at their wedding, Sarah as a newborn, James taking his first steps. All of it could have ended on a runway in Arizona, but it hadn't, because of decisions made in crisis, because of training that had prepared him for moments he never anticipated experiencing in this way. Derek thought about the young mother and her daughter. He thought about the elderly couple who had embraced him on the tarmac. He thought about the hundreds of futures that would continue because of what happened on Flight 447. And for the first time since the landing, Derek Morrison allowed himself to understand that maybe, just maybe, the word hero wasn't entirely inappropriate. 3 weeks after Flight 447 touched down at Williams Gateway Airport, Derek sat in his home office in San Diego, surrounded by letters. Hundreds of letters. They arrived in his mailbox daily, handwritten notes, printed cards, some typed on official letterhead from companies and organizations. Each one represented a person or a family whose futures had continued because of decisions made at 34,000 feet. Derek picked up one letter at random. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the writing of someone for whom penmanship mattered. Dear Captain Morrison, I am writing to you from the University of Arizona, where I was accepted to begin my doctoral studies in environmental science this fall. I was on Flight 447 with my parents. I don't know if you remember us, but my mother was the woman crying in the back of the cabin, and my father held her hand throughout the entire emergency. I want you to know that because of your actions, I will graduate with my PhD. I will conduct research that I hope will contribute to solving climate change. My children, if I'm blessed to have them, will grow up because you were present in a moment of crisis. Thank you for giving me the chance to make a difference in this world. Derek had to set the letter down. His eyes were burning. This was the weight of heroism that he was still learning to carry. It wasn't the immediate action. That part was muscle memory, trained response, professional instinct. The weight came later when you realized that every person you saved had a trajectory, a future, a cascade of possibilities that rippled outward through time. He opened another letter, this one from the young mother with her daughter. My daughter Emma is 4 years old. She loves to draw pictures and dance and ask endless questions about how things work. Because of you, she will go to kindergarten next year. She will have birthday parties and first crushes and graduations. She will grow up. She will have a future. I can never adequately express my gratitude for that gift. But I wanted you to know, Emma's favorite color is now blue, like the sky and airplanes. When she grows up, I think she wants to be a pilot. Derek laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh at the ending. The little girl who'd been terrified during the emergency now wanted to fly. There was something profoundly beautiful about that transformation. The media attention had begun to fade by the 3rd week. The initial news cycle had run its course. The dramatic emergency landing, the Navy SEAL hero, the grateful passengers. News networks had moved on to other stories, other crises, other human interest narratives. But for Derek, the impact remained acute and real. Captain Harrison had organized a reunion dinner for everyone aboard Flight 447. It was held at a nice restaurant in Phoenix, neutral ground between Los Angeles, where the flight had originated, and Denver, where it was supposed to land. About 60 passengers attended, along with the flight crew. Derek arrived late, uncertain whether he wanted to be there, uncertain whether reliving the experience would be therapeutic or traumatic. He was immediately approached by the elderly couple who'd been sitting near the front of the cabin. The husband embraced him with surprising strength for a man in his 80s. "We made reservations to visit our grandchildren," the woman said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "We were so afraid we wouldn't make it, but because of you, we got to meet our newest granddaughter. We got to hold her." Throughout the evening, Derek encountered story after story of lives that had continued because of that single moment of crisis. The businessman had reconciled with his estranged daughter. The teenage boy had graduated from high school and been accepted to college. The woman who'd been reading a novel during the emergency had finished writing her own novel about survival and resilience and had found a literary agent. These weren't abstract statistics. These were human beings with dreams and families and futures that extended outward in infinite complexity. Each of them had been given a reprieve from tragedy, and they were living with the profound gratitude that comes from nearly losing everything. As the evening progressed, Derek found himself standing on the restaurant's patio, looking out at the Phoenix skyline. Captain Harrison joined him, holding 2 glasses of wine. "I've been thinking about something," Harrison said, handing Derek a glass. "In my 27 years as a pilot, I've trained for emergencies, simulated countless scenarios, but I've never actually had to handle a real emergency like this. I know pilots who have gone their entire careers without facing something this severe." "You handled it perfectly," Derek said. "The landing was flawless given the circumstances." "No," Harrison replied, shaking his head. "What made it flawless was having someone in that cockpit who could think beyond the immediate crisis. You assessed the situation with tactical precision. You made unconventional decisions when conventional procedures wouldn't work. You gave me confidence when I was terrified." Derek sipped his wine, considering the assessment. It was true that his military training had prepared him for exactly this kind of situation: high-stress decision-making, rapid assessment of variables, taking action despite uncertainty. But he'd never thought of it as something that would apply outside of combat situations. "I've been asked to participate in a training program," Harrison continued. "The FAA wants to use this incident as a case study for emergency procedures training. They want me to work with flight crews, discussing what went right and what we could have done differently. They've asked if you'd be willing to participate." Derek considered this. The idea of standing in front of groups of airline pilots and discussing the emergency made him uncomfortable, but it also made sense. His perspective, the military perspective, the tactical perspective, the SEAL mindset, was something the civilian aviation community could benefit from. "I'll do it," Derek said finally. Over the following months, Derek found himself in a new role. He participated in FAA training seminars. He gave talks at military bases about emergency decision-making. He worked with flight crews and emergency responders, sharing the lessons he'd learned, not just from Flight 447, but from 19 years of military service that had prepared him to be useful in a moment when everything went wrong. But it was the letters that meant the most. He received hundreds of them. A woman who'd used the reprieve of survival to leave an abusive relationship. A man who'd completed his cancer treatment and lived to see his children graduate. A flight attendant who'd been inspired by Sarah's professionalism during the emergency to pursue a career in emergency management. One letter particularly struck him. It came from a 10-year-old boy named Marcus, whose parents had been on Flight 447. "Dear Captain Morrison, my mom says you saved all our lives. I don't really understand what that means, but I know my parents are really grateful. I'm writing because I want to be like you when I grow up. I want to help people and be brave. I'm going to work hard in school and maybe join the Navy like you. Thank you for showing me what a hero looks like." Derek kept that letter on his desk, not for ego or pride, but as a reminder of why his service mattered. It wasn't about the medals or the commendations. It was about being prepared when the moment came. It was about training so thoroughly that when chaos arrived, you could function with calm clarity. It was about understanding that heroism wasn't something you chose. It was something that emerged from being ready when you were needed. 19 years of service had culminated in one moment at 34,000 feet. But Derek understood now that the service wasn't about that single moment. The service was about being the kind of person who could respond effectively when a moment like that arrived. As he sat in his home office, surrounded by letters from 197 lives that had continued, Derek finally understood the full measure of what his dedication meant. Jennifer was right to be proud. His commanding officer was right to insist on recognition. But more than that, all these people, the young mother with her daughter, the elderly couple meeting their granddaughter, the boy who now dreamed of being a hero, they were the measure of his life's work. The word Mayday no longer meant danger to Derek Morrison. It meant purpose. It meant that training and discipline and preparation could save lives. It meant that 197 people would go home to their families, would pursue their dreams, would live their lives, because one Navy SEAL pilot happened to be sleeping in seat when everything went wrong. Derek looked at the photograph of his family on his desk, Jennifer, Sarah, and James, all smiling at the camera. He thought about how close he'd come to not seeing them, how easily that moment could have ended differently. Then he pulled out paper and began writing responses to the letters, because heroism, he'd learned, wasn't just about acting in the moment. It was also about acknowledging the impact of those actions on the lives you touched. It was about building community from shared survival. The sun set over San Diego as Derek wrote, connecting with people whose futures he'd helped preserve. And in that simple act of acknowledgement and gratitude, the true meaning of his service became clear. 3 weeks after Flight 447 touched down at Williams Gateway Airport, Derek sat in his home office in San Diego, surrounded by letters. Hundreds of letters. They arrived in his mailbox daily, handwritten notes, printed cards, some typed on official letterhead from companies and organizations. Each one represented a person or a family whose futures had continued because of decisions made at 34,000 feet. Derek picked up one letter at random. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the writing of someone for whom penmanship mattered. Dear Captain Morrison, I am writing to you from the University of Arizona, where I was accepted to begin my doctoral studies in environmental science this fall. I was on Flight 447 with my parents. I don't know if you remember us, but my mother was the woman crying in the back of the cabin, and my father held her hand throughout the entire emergency. I want you to know that because of your actions, I will graduate with my PhD. I will conduct research that I hope will contribute to solving climate change. My children, if I'm blessed to have them, will grow up because you were present in a moment of crisis. Thank you for giving me the chance to make a difference in this world. Derek had to set the letter down. His eyes were burning. This was the weight of heroism that he was still learning to carry. It wasn't the immediate action. That part was muscle memory, trained response, professional instinct. The weight came later when you realized that every person you saved had a trajectory, a future, a cascade of possibilities that rippled outward through time. He opened another letter, this one from the young mother with her daughter. My daughter Emma is 4 years old. She loves to draw pictures and dance and ask endless questions about how things work. Because of you, she will go to kindergarten next year. She will have birthday parties and first crushes and graduations. She will grow up. She will have a future. I can never adequately express my gratitude for that gift. But I wanted you to know, Emma's favorite color is now blue, like the sky and airplanes. When she grows up, I think she wants to be a pilot. Derek laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh at the ending. The little girl who'd been terrified during the emergency now wanted to fly. There was something profoundly beautiful about that transformation. The media attention had begun to fade by the 3rd week. The initial news cycle had run its course. The dramatic emergency landing, the Navy SEAL hero, the grateful passengers. News networks had moved on to other stories, other crises, other human interest narratives. But for Derek, the impact remained acute and real. Captain Harrison had organized a reunion dinner for everyone aboard Flight 447. It was held at a nice restaurant in Phoenix, neutral ground between Los Angeles, where the flight had originated, and Denver, where it was supposed to land. About 60 passengers attended, along with the flight crew. Derek arrived late, uncertain whether he wanted to be there, uncertain whether reliving the experience would be therapeutic or traumatic. He was immediately approached by the elderly couple who'd been sitting near the front of the cabin. The husband embraced him with surprising strength for a man in his 80s. "We made reservations to visit our grandchildren," the woman said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "We were so afraid we wouldn't make it, but because of you, we got to meet our newest granddaughter. We got to hold her." Throughout the evening, Derek encountered story after story of lives that had continued because of that single moment of crisis. The businessman had reconciled with his estranged daughter. The teenage boy had graduated from high school and been accepted to college. The woman who'd been reading a novel during the emergency had finished writing her own novel about survival and resilience and had found a literary agent. These weren't abstract statistics. These were human beings with dreams and families and futures that extended outward in infinite complexity. Each of them had been given a reprieve from tragedy, and they were living with the profound gratitude that comes from nearly losing everything. As the evening progressed, Derek found himself standing on the restaurant's patio, looking out at the Phoenix skyline. Captain Harrison joined him, holding 2 glasses of wine. "I've been thinking about something," Harrison said, handing Derek a glass. "In my 27 years as a pilot, I've trained for emergencies, simulated countless scenarios, but I've never actually had to handle a real emergency like this. I know pilots who have gone their entire careers without facing something this severe." "You handled it perfectly," Derek said. "The landing was flawless given the circumstances." "No," Harrison replied, shaking his head. "What made it flawless was having someone in that cockpit who could think beyond the immediate crisis. You assessed the situation with tactical precision. You made unconventional decisions when conventional procedures wouldn't work. You gave me confidence when I was terrified." Derek sipped his wine, considering the assessment. It was true that his military training had prepared him for exactly this kind of situation: high-stress decision-making, rapid assessment of variables, taking action despite uncertainty. But he'd never thought of it as something that would apply outside of combat situations. "I've been asked to participate in a training program," Harrison continued. "The FAA wants to use this incident as a case study for emergency procedures training. They want me to work with flight crews, discussing what went right and what we could have done differently. They've asked if you'd be willing to participate." Derek considered this. The idea of standing in front of groups of airline pilots and discussing the emergency made him uncomfortable, but it also made sense. His perspective, the military perspective, the tactical perspective, the SEAL mindset, was something the civilian aviation community could benefit from. "I'll do it," Derek said finally. Over the following months, Derek found himself in a new role. He participated in FAA training seminars. He gave talks at military bases about emergency decision-making. He worked with flight crews and emergency responders, sharing the lessons he'd learned, not just from Flight 447, but from 19 years of military service that had prepared him to be useful in a moment when everything went wrong. But it was the letters that meant the most. He received hundreds of them. A woman who'd used the reprieve of survival to leave an abusive relationship. A man who'd completed his cancer treatment and lived to see his children graduate. A flight attendant who'd been inspired by Sarah's professionalism during the emergency to pursue a career in emergency management. One letter particularly struck him. It came from a 10-year-old boy named Marcus, whose parents had been on Flight 447. Dear Captain Morrison, my mom says you saved all our lives. I don't really understand what that means, but I know my parents are really grateful. I'm writing because I want to be like you when I grow up. I want to help people and be brave. I'm going to work hard in school and maybe join the Navy like you. Thank you for showing me what a hero looks like. Derek kept that letter on his desk, not for ego or pride, but as a reminder of why his service mattered. It wasn't about the medals or the commendations. It was about being prepared when the moment came. It was about training so thoroughly that when chaos arrived, you could function with calm clarity. It was about understanding that heroism wasn't something you chose. It was something that emerged from being ready when you were needed. 19 years of service had culminated in one moment at 34,000 feet. But Derek understood now that the service wasn't about that single moment. The service was about being the kind of person who could respond effectively when a moment like that arrived. As he sat in his home office, surrounded by letters from 197 lives that had continued, Derek finally understood the full measure of what his dedication meant. Jennifer was right to be proud. His commanding officer was right to insist on recognition. But more than that, all these people, the young mother with her daughter, the elderly couple meeting their granddaughter, the boy who now dreamed of being a hero, they were the measure of his life's work. The word Mayday no longer meant danger to Derek Morrison. It meant purpose. It meant that training and discipline and preparation could save lives. It meant that 197 people would go home to their families, would pursue their dreams, would live their lives, because one Navy SEAL pilot happened to be sleeping in seat when everything went wrong. Derek looked at the photograph of his family on his desk, Jennifer, Sarah, and James, all smiling at the camera. He thought about how close he'd come to not seeing them, how easily that moment could have ended differently. Then he pulled out paper and began writing responses to the letters, because heroism, he'd learned, wasn't just about acting in the moment. It was also about acknowledging the impact of those actions on the lives you touched. It was about building community from shared survival. The sun set over San Diego as Derek wrote, connecting with people whose futures he'd helped preserve. And in that simple act of acknowledgement and gratitude, the true meaning of his service became clear.